Hello and welcome along to another episode of In Conservation With. Tonight, well, actually, it depends where you are in the world, but for me, it's tonight. We are speaking with Bella Lack, a young conservationist, excuse me, an activist who I've been trying to contact for 1,000 years to get onto this. So I'm really very delighted that she's broken from a busy schedule to actually come and speak to us tonight. And this is her book, The Children of the Anthropocene, which we'll be talking about. In fact, this will be the background of our conversation tonight. So we're going to be talking about climate change and all that sort of stuff. But before we even go there, let me just quickly talk about how we're going to do tonight. And one thing I want to say is that I must actually talk about our sponsors for tonight just very quickly, because without them, we will not be sort of doing anything. Firstly, Leica Sport Optics, thank you very much for organizing your sponsorship of this. And also, I'd like to thank CJ Wildlife. And for those who don't know, they are a team of passionate nature lovers and experts in garden wildlife. And they're on a mission to make nature accessible for everyone. And that's whether you are a nature novice or a garden guru, they want to inspire and educate and provide the right tools to help wildlife thrive right on your doorstep. So that's them. So we can actually get on with our night tonight. And I'd like to welcome Bella. Bella, well, the question I want to ask you is, how are you and where are you?
Right now I'm at my uni. I started 4 weeks ago now. And I've locked the door because all the time, this is something I wasn't used to before, this culture of just going into everyone's rooms. So I've had to lock the door and warn people that from 7 to 8, they can't run into my room saying, let's go out preeing. So I'm really hoping we're going to have an uninterrupted hour. And how am I? I'm good. Starting uni was a complete whirlwind, one of the most intense times in my life, I think, that first week. But now it's beginning to settle down. And yesterday I joined this climbing society, and we went climbing in about an hour away from here in Scotland. And it was just incredible. We were bouldering, so you climb without ropes, but just on a lower level. And I loved it. I don't think my dad loved it when I told him when I got home.
No, I
Um,
mean, that sounds a bit dangerous, doesn't it?
yeah, well, so I'm actually not that good, but these guys there were incredible. They've been doing it for years. And they were climbing something which was about probably 5 meters, which doesn't sound high, but it was this vertical slab of rock. And when you land, it's obviously rock as well. So just watching them, I was kind of on the edge of my seat. There wasn't a seat, but I was really nervous. How are you anyway?
You know what? I'm not bad. I have the same problem as you in a way, because I'm in someone's guest house. I'm in their kitchen, and at any moment, someone could burst in to make a cup of tea. So I'm sort of got the door shut. I can't lock it. So I'm just hoping that no one
Yeah,
runs in on us. Whereabouts in Scotland are you? In Edinburgh?
I'm in Edinburgh. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. Listen, you don't really give many interviews, I've noticed. In my research on you, I mean, I've seen you on Twitter. And by the way, Zoomers, Bella is one person I have not met. We don't know each other because I say the vast majority of my guests on In Conservation With, I've kind of at least met, online, but I've not met you at all. You seem to be a very sort of, not secretive, but very kind of keep it all down below the bonnet, under the bonnet even. Do you get
Yeah,
that
I think
obvious?
it's a bit of a problem because so much of what I do has been about amplifying messages and voices, but also I simultaneously really hate social media, and I kind of it's getting more and more increasingly. I have to force myself to go on social media because I care so much about the message, um, but the method I have to use to spread it isn't my favorite. So yeah, I have also you might not have noticed interviews in the past few years because I've been doing my A levels, and I said to myself during my GCSEs, even before one of my GCSEs, I was out the night before at a protest and a panel. Um, And I said, I can't do that during A levels. It's not sustainable. And then as soon as that's done, I was promoting the book during A levels. And then as soon as that's done, I'll get back to it. So here I am 3 weeks into uni.
The thing is, you say you hate social media, but you've got 137,000 or 137.6 thousand followers on Twitter. That's a lot of people. But I understand what you mean by not loving. I mean, I
Yeah.
wouldn't do it myself if it wasn't for the fact that you have to try and, well, you use it to put out a message. And I think it's for that, it's a very good tool, actually.
There's two sides. It's really a double-edged sword. So there's an incredible accessibility with social media, and the climate strikes, which started a few years ago, would not have had the same um, momentum that they gain at all without it. But then there's also the echo chamber, which I'm sure you've seen, which I kind of operate in, that we have our, our conservation circle, our friends. And the tricky thing that we have to do now is break beyond it. And I often get asked this question, which is, what do you do when you get hate and opposition on social media? And I actually love it because it means I'm reaching people who aren't in that echo chamber. And I kind of, if you see it a bit like a boat, when a boat goes faster in water, it has more resistance. And I think the more resistance we feel on social media, it's because we're having more impact. We're going faster as a movement in a way. So I can't even remember where that tangent came from. Social media, yeah. So I don't like it particularly, but I recognize how important it is. And I kind of like getting the opposition.
It's interesting because to me, you have been born in the right time, really, because when I was 17, there wasn't anyone around doing what you're doing. I wasn't doing that myself, and I didn't consider myself a conservationist until way down the line.
Yeah.
I'm interested in birds, and I suppose in the very beginning I was trying to sort of engage with other people that weren't interested. In fact, most people I met weren't interested anyway, or didn't, weren't birders. So therefore, I was already trying to educate people from that young age, but I had no reference points. But
Can I ask you where it started for you? So you didn't consider yourself a conservationist, but were you, on paper, would you have been a conservationist at 8, 9?
I don't know. Well, look, where it came from, I often say previous life, because I was born in a region of London, northwest London, which was predominantly Black and Irish immigrants. Absolutely no one around me had any interest whatsoever in natural history. I didn't have a mentor, but this was in me, and I taught myself. So it's a very different world to your world at the moment, which I'm not saying is any easier or any harder. It's just a different world, and it would have been interesting to know how we could have worked back then. But then I suppose back then there wasn't that awareness that we have now. I mean, climate change, who had even thought of the term, let alone realize what was happening back, in the 70s, 60s, 80s, what have you. So this is all a modern day phenomenon, really. But with you, Bella, where did your interest come, and did it sort of start as a natural history interest and then developed into the environment, or were you sort of straight in there with the environmental stuff?
It's quite a hard thing to pinpoint because I have a sister and a brother, both older than me, and I was always the one that was outside. I would go and spend summers with at my uncle's farm. And I had this kind of inherent love of nature. And it was only when I was about 11, 12, and I finally had access to not social media, but I think it was YouTube. And I watched a video about palm oil and the effects on orangutans. And I had a passion for that species, which I didn't have for any other species at that time. Just this really intense fascination. And I watched this video and I was just struck by how we could be doing something to another species, especially because they're so similar to us. When you just watch their movements, the way they think, the way they act towards their offspring. And so I began campaigning about palm oil, and I started this campaign called In Our Palm, thinking I was going to go get rid of palm oil in all supermarkets. I gave a speech in school, did a podcast with one of, I think, my mum's friends. I spoke to her about it, and I really thought 2 months down the line I would have shut down the palm oil industry. And looking back now, I can see how naive I was. and also how wrong I was, because that's another thing which I'm sure you've had to do, and many activists, conservationists have to actually recognize that what they've said and something they've been campaigning for has been wrong, because palm oil has an incredibly high yield compared to other types of oil. So actually it's much more sustainable than others. So I had to kind of go back and say, okay, what I did was not necessarily right, and the way I did it, giving a speech at school, probably wasn't going to make that much impact, but it did set me off on this path of discovery of, well, a terrible path of discovering what humanity is doing to our planet. But I guess it got me where I am today.
Because the thing is, I think it's not a wrong thing to do at all, because I think, by making these, well, we don't know everything. And obviously, when you're sitting in England talking about palm oil, and a lot of the palm oil industry is actually obviously outside of England, and you haven't been there at that age, at that point, you can only go by the facts. And I remember I went to Costa Rica last year, and I went to a sustainable palm oil forest basically. And when they mentioned the word sustainable and palm oil in the same sentence, I thought, how can that be? But then when I actually arrived, I realized, actually, yeah, that is the case. So it's very confusing though, Bella, because there's all these things you think are really wrong and bad. And then when you actually scratch the surface, it's like, for example, I was talking to someone the other day about indigenous tribes in Southern America, in South America. And, you are led to believe that they are the complete sustainability model, complete, they do everything within reason. And, but I've heard, on the contrary, I've heard that some, maybe not necessarily in South America, but elsewhere, are not very sustainable in what they do. And if you think yourself, I've lived all my life holding those guys up as being the beacon we need to follow. And in reality, they're not what they seem. Have you been finding that in your life, these things?
Yeah, so much. I think when you begin, well, definitely because I was so young as well, it was very binary. I was thinking there's white and black in conservation, there's right and wrong, and saving the planet, as some say, or destroying it. And then as you learn more, you realize that actually there are no binaries, and it's so much more complex. And one example is, I'm sure COP15 is coming up, and one of the big points they're going to be discussing at COP15 is 30 by 30. So we need to protect 30% of the planet's most biodiverse areas by 2030. And as I was researching this, I was thinking, wow, that's so easy, just those two numbers, that's what we need to get governments to do. And then Greenpeace and Survival International, which talk a lot about Indigenous rights, are saying that actually that's a fortress conservation model, and it's going to impact on Indigenous people by kind of displacing them from their land, causing dispossession of land. So then really there is no one solution. And you think, okay, well, we could do 30 by 30, but that's going to cause problems, and we cannot do it. But then we're not going to have any land left for anyone, because biodiversity will be completely destroyed. So what you've got to do is research into everything and recognize that there's no perfection, and the solution is not a silver bullet, but it's going to be multifaceted. And I can just see my mum's entered the waiting room. Don't let her in.
Too late.
Oh no. She's up in London. I haven't seen her for a few weeks, so this is going to be the first time that she's seen I'm alive at university.
Good. I won't say anything when you told us before. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you just saying that, and again, you're one of the people that currently are the individuals that we're kind of looking up to lead us. And if you're saying, it's not a perfect scenario and it's actually quite complex, it kind of makes you think, well, what can we do? It's kind of back to square one again in terms of how do we address this problem. I mean, I got a whole lot of questions I've been asking myself for years, and one of them is, why don't people see what's happening? Why don't people realize that our environment is intrinsically connected to us? And the more we slash at it and cut away things and kill things, it's a death by 1,000 cuts for us. Why do we not see that?
Yeah, I think so. Part of the book, we're speaking to so many young people, and one of the things that I recognized speaking to them was this clarity, and all of them were asking the same question as you, which is, how can people be putting profit above planet when it's so obvious that there won't be any profit on a dead planet? And an organization I work with, we found, so there's lots of young people protecting an area of land in Ecuador, and we found illegal miners on this land, and we had to break this news to this, it's Reserva Youth Land Trust, to this big group of young people who had been fundraising to protect this land. And I think the question was just this kind of confusion at how miners could prioritize a bit of mineral, gold and pyrite under the ground over the thrumming biodiversity which covered, the Ecuadorian cloud forest is just full of biodiversity, one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet. How could a person prioritize a tiny bit of gold under the ground over all of that biodiversity? And I think the answer is desperation in many cases. And that's why it's so important when we're thinking about sustainability, about animals and wildlife, to also keep in mind the social aspect, because often people don't have a malicious intent. They don't want to kill animals, they don't want to destroy the environment, but it's very easy for me to say, to someone a poacher, for example, don't kill an elephant. But if you're trying to feed your family, that's going to cause issues. So I think what we need to remember is that we can't just approach environmentalism with this one mindset, and we have to take into account the social factors. So yes, it is complex, but it's going to require sacrifices, it's going to require thinking and dialogue. And that's why things like this are so important, because we might come out with more questions, but we'll also come out with this multifaceted array of solutions, and different people in different places can apply different solutions, if that makes sense. So a business, a community at different levels, a government can find what works best for them and then apply that.
Yeah, I suppose in different cultures as well. But I mean, I was reading your book, I read it again the other day, and that section you talked about Ecuador, I mean, my heart fell through the floor when, the discovery was made that there was mining going on within a nature reserve that you guys have been sort of working towards in terms of, raising money for and awareness. That, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and it was the hardest bit, just breaking this news to the young people, because once again, the clarity and the confusion, just trying to explain the motive of these miners is really, really difficult.
Yeah. I mean, your book covers quite a few things, from plastics through to water and also connectivity. So I want to talk to you about some of those elements. But the actual book itself, The Children of the Anthropocene, how did you find the writing process? Because, it's your first book, I presume. How did you find that? Because it fascinates me. Because it's so, by the way, Zoomers, it's so eloquently written. It's really, I think it's one of those books that will be referred to in the future for a long time to come. Hopefully, we have got a long time to come ahead. But it's one of those books that I found very engrossing and very well researched. So how did you find that process of writing the book?
I wrote it, so I actually began in 2020 during the lockdown. And for me, every day in my allocated little leaving the house, I would go and sit by the river and write for maybe 3-4 hours. And I actually loved it. I really, really enjoyed it, because I was speaking to young people. I would also do the Zooms in the morning. I would Zoom with young people around the world. And at a time when we were all having to be really locked up in these, in 4 walls, suddenly I had this way to expand, to speak to young people. And yes, it was this roller coaster of emotions. It was devastating, but hopefully what you got from the book as well was that it's overwhelmingly positive and hopeful. And there's this incredible quote by Mary Hegler, which I put in the book, which is that we can be overwhelmed by the complexity of the problem or fall in love with the creativity of the solution. And, young people are renowned, especially very young people, renowned for their creativity. And just speaking to all these different young people around the world with all these different solutions was so kind of affirming at a time when everything was going downhill.
Yeah, because there's several points I can pull out from the book, and one term that you used was rewilding ourselves, which I thought was a really fair. I love that notion of rewilding ourselves.
Yeah.
People talks about rewilding, but actually it's something within us as well. We need to have a different mindset to actually get involved in that. You also got your book, the book Forward, written by the great one and only Greta Thunberg. How did that happen?
So it's funny because whenever I speak about the book, that's one of the most frequent questions. We can speak about that later because me and David had a bit of a prequel for this, and we discussed, the sensationalization of a person in the environmental movement, which is quite interesting. But that happened because I had her email from some previous campaign that we had been working on. And what you find in the youth environmental sector is everyone slightly knows each other, even if it's just recognizing the name or maybe the face. And then we're all in different group chats. And sometimes there are 200 people in a group chat because it's a very global movement. But because of social media, because of WhatsApp and Twitter, it's very easy to access the other young people, and you have to do it in order to mobilize a global movement. So that's how I had Greta's email.
Yeah, actually, we can talk about that point we discussed earlier now, I think, because I think it's quite relevant. And that is the media at the moment, or maybe always, they always seem to want to compare. So I know that you, for example, have been compared to or been called Britain's answer to Greta. And I loved watching you on some program, one of those breakfast programs, when the presenter, who I'm not really keen on, asked you in a very condescending way, what do you think about being compared to Greta?
Yeah.
And your answer was great because you paused and then you just said, well, the association is really great, thank you very much, but it's about the message and not the messenger, which I found really profound in terms of a young person like you saying that. But we live in a society where it's all about celebrity, it's all about, even within our world, in the environmental world, I found people, I can see people who are craving or more interested in their persona and their publicity, their self-publicity, than the actual message itself. A, do you find that? And B, why do you think, especially with media, why do you think there has to be a spokesperson or a person that people kind of latch onto and has to be the final word in any conversation?
Yeah, well, to the first one, I've definitely found that because, and when we're talking about Greta, this is simply because she's one of the most renowned faces in the environmental movement. And I wouldn't say it's her fault, but I think it's the media's fault for sensationalizing an individual. And it's become a cult of personality in the same way the Kardashians, or I can't even think of it, another cult of Simon Cowell, if you lived in
Or yeah, One Direction, that bloke in One Direction.
One Direction, Harry Styles. Oh no, but he
Yeah.
deserves it. He deserves it. But yeah, some of his new songs, I think. But yeah, it's become a cult of personality in the same way that a celebrity would, or a reality TV show. And once again, we need to focus on the message. And I do understand why it's happened, because as humans, we need to relate to an individual. And I talk about this a lot in the book. In fact, it's why I wrote the book, because we relate so much better to emotional stories rather than statistics, which is what we saw with Cecil the lion, with Harambe the gorilla. Thousands, in fact millions of animals are killed every day in different species in different ways for different purposes, but we related to that lion and that gorilla because their faces and their stories were plastered over the media, and they were individuals. And so when Greta is held up as a spokesperson, it's because we can read about her story, her background, and we love a familiar face. But I think what the media really needs to do is not sensationalize an individual, but sensationalize stories instead. And there are so many stories all over the world which are waiting to be heard. And it's that diversity and uplifting those different stories, which I think could completely propel us out of this kind of rut that we're in now, because we don't need one solution. As we talked about earlier, we need many solutions. And the only way to do that is to have many different stories rather than individual. Exactly. I don't know, have you found a similar thing, that we're in a bit of a rut because it's been, as you say, we haven't met we've met the same people, we probably have many mutuals because it's the same circles which are operating and the same voices being amplified.
Yeah, I've noticed that. And what's interesting, when I first started my professional career as the urban birder, I came from a commercial background, so I was very aware of how some of these things worked. And I have to be honest, I played it because I thought, if this is the only way to get the general media to react, then you have to sort of feed them information or feed them things that will make them react, but you make sure you're in control of it. So in other words, it becomes a Trojan horse. The urban birder, the Trojan horse. The urban birder was all about telling people in the media, oh, you can watch birds in urban areas. It's like doing meditation or Pilates, you know. Oh, and they can sort of get to that and they can understand that, and then it's all over it. You know, they're all over it. So you kind of use it. And similarly with the media, social media, you do the same as well. But in my instance, being one of the very few black faces within this whole sort of industry also has its benefits and negatives. I mean, my career, I'll say in the very beginning, was all about being as a result, or mostly about being as a result of positive discrimination. You know, my first TV break, the commissioning editor said to me, if you were white, we wouldn't have taken you. And he just told me that. So, you know, it's
did that make you feel, how did that make you feel when he said that? Did you just think, this is good because I've got the job? Or I guess it's quite demeaning when someone says that. Then you feel it's not.
I was angry about it, but then I thought to myself, well, I've been given an opportunity that should have been given to me because of what I can do as opposed to what I look like. But that's given me a platform, which means I can go on that platform and say what I want, and you know, start sort of garnering interest and following that way. So that's what I did in the initial days and years. So yeah, it's not great, and I still see it to this day happening. You know, I've got a massive problem with how nature is sold to us. And I think some of the Zoomers know about this and heard me talk about it all the time, but I just hate the way that nature is sold to us, which I want to talk to you a bit later on when it comes to disconnection from nature, because I think that's part of the reason why. But people always say, and have always said, that the future of the world, the planet, or whatever, is in the young people's hands. Now, are they saying that because the older people, the older generation are lazy and basically not caring about what happens and thinking to themselves, oh, someone else will deal with it, i.e. the younger people? And why do you think that's the case? Why do you think people say that? Why can't we all just deal with it now together?
I think the interesting thing is when I began, I was 11, 12, and I would still speak in the sense that I would say, I want to protect this planet for my children, the hypothetical children, and we're handing down a poison chalice right now. And just in that time since I've started, the question has changed from, you know, which species are going to go extinct to now which ones can we save, and can we protect our planet for our children, to can we protect it for ourselves? And the dialogue has changed, not just because, you know, I've learned more, but also because of the urgency. And so for older people to say to younger people, oh, you're so inspiring, and seeing you is making me feel like I can kind of sit back because you're all being so proactive, I don't think in any way it's motivating, because of the, yes, young people are getting involved, but that's not simply because my generation are waking up, it's because the urgency is increasing. And so we need more people to rise up to meet the scale of the crisis and to meet the urgency. So rather than saying, you know, you're inspirational, it should be, this movement is really inspiring, I want to be part of it. It needs to be an intergenerational thing. And there's absolutely no way that we can wait for young people to be in the positions that current positions of power are right now. It has to be an immediate thing. And speaking to the young people I spoke to for the book, you know, it's not some intangible future crisis. As you know, as everyone here knows, it's happening right now, everywhere across the globe. And yes, factors like wealth and privilege are going to protect some people for a bit, but it's not going to get rid of the problem. And I think as our responsibility as humans is to do all we can for those who are already being affected, and to recognize that also we'll all be affected. It'll just be a matter of time.
So the other main question I always ask myself is, why does the world react so slowly? Why do people who have the power to get something changed not bother or kind of play it down? Why is our government, for example, hell bent on destroying all the all the stuff that's put in place for the environment and nature for the sake of the economy, as I put it? Why do not people who have intelligence realize that if you look further down the road, what they're trying to do now is not sustainable? Why? I don't understand why they don't actually see that and try and make things work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but I can't answer it because I think if I could, I'd be able to change, I'd be able to change a lot. And I asked myself that again so Liz Truss has put in a place where she could change so much and has just licensed 100 oil and gas, new fracking locations for oil and gas. And you ask yourself, when you're in that position of power, what would motivate you? And I think the first thing is comfort, because those are the systems that our society is predicated on. And right now, our government, but also many individuals, prioritize growth above all else. And when we have infinite and unsustainable growth in a human body, we call it cancer. But for some reason, our society calls infinite and unsustainable growth progress. So I think what we need to do, and what our government needs to do, is completely change that narrative. Well, we have a much more circular economy, and Amsterdam was doing that in 2020 during lockdown. And for some reason, our government can't seem to grasp the fact that we can't keep having that growth. And yes, they're incredibly stupid in most ways, but have an intelligence high enough to recognize the logic that we can't have this infinite growth. So I can't answer that question, but if anyone else could, please come in.
Yeah, I mean, it's we're all part of what Liz Truss calls the anti-growth coalition, aren't we? But okay, there's people out there. There's always been people campaigning, and I think one of the ways to change things, in fact, one of the main ways, when you think about women's rights in some countries, racial discrimination and how that's been abolished in places, it's been because of people taking action. It's been, people on the streets in number, and writing about it and creating art and all that sort of stuff. Currently, we've got people like Just Stop Oil campaigning, and another group, I can't remember what they're called, but they're going around slashing tires of 4x4s and SUVs to make their point. Do you think, that style of campaigning effectively damaging people's property in some instances is an effective way of getting that message across in terms of what we need to do for this planet?
I think we need radical action, in the sense, so the Extinction Rebellion protests, there have been some which I wouldn't agree with. For example, the recent one, throwing the soup, I think, can get to a point where throwing the soup over the Van Gogh painting, can get to a point where, yes, we need the media to recognize the urgency, but also you don't want to ostracize the majority of people, and that is what happens. And there's a fine line between stigmatizing environmentalism and raising awareness of the urgency of the crisis. And I think the radical actions that Extinction Rebellion did a few years ago, for example, George Monbiot got arrested because they wouldn't move from, I think it was Parliament Square, and something like that, where he was able to give this speech when he was being taken away, and it garnered lots of media attention, I think is completely warranted. And some people say, well, why would you sacrifice yourself for a bit of publicity, a bit of media attention? And the reason is because think about the damage that's going to be done in 20, 30 years. In comparison, what's being done by these protests is very small. I think it depends on the individual action that's happening. But to all those who are opposed to it, I would say, you have to look at the scale of what's going to happen in comparison to the small bit of damage being done at these protests. What are your thoughts on it?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think, I'm quite commercially minded in many respects, in terms of, I understand, because I think sometimes when, in my world anyway, some conservationists often just see things through the lens of being a conservationist. And, you know, like you've just mentioned and spoken about all evening, you have to have your eyes open and see reality. Not reality, as you say, it's not black and white. But I find some of those actions, you know, like blocking main arterial roads, I don't think it's a great thing, because, you know, the average person on the street, in inverted commas, you want them behind you. You know, it's not just your kind of person or your kind of group that hangs out with you. You want all people from across all walks of life to understand and be behind you. And you just ostracize immediately. Your message is lost, because at the end of the day, people have their lives to lead as well, and some might have, you know, emergency situations. I mean, I was reading about someone's tires being slashed, and they needed the car to take their elderly parent somewhere, you know, or, you know, whatever. So it's you know, I'd rather see those people going into the houses of people who have power and emptying their fridge of milk, as opposed to pouring out milk in the middle of a supermarket in a local area.
Yeah, and I think for me, lots of the way I base my action is about engaging. And as I said about earlier with the opposition I face on Twitter, I'd much rather, for example, engage with those people than block them. And so the method I really like to use is, for example, storytelling, which reaches a wide amount of people, has the potential to reach a wide amount of people if it's told right, for example, in the media, but it doesn't stigmatize actions. But once again, you know, there is no silver bullet, and it's the same with governmental actions. There are different ways to get to the same solution. And gaining attention for an issue, I think people are going to have their own pathways. So maybe we could speak about it when we're done with the chat with the audience, but I really like to hear what other people think on this one as well, because there's no right or wrong. I think it's quite subjective.
Do you think that a lot of young people are behind the protests, even though they might not necessarily want to be involved? Do you think that young people are actually on board with what's going on in the world, or do you still think, well, I don't know if I'm not saying you still think in terms of you thought this before, but do you think that there's people out there growing up who don't really, you know, have any interest or knowledge or care, and are just going through life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in any generation, there are people who care deeply, and then there are people who are just going to live on a superficial level and not do anything to change their life and to make it more ethical and sustainable. But if we're looking at the majority, I think most of the young people I've spoken to, environmentalist activists or not, just friends from school, would agree that lots of the actions that have been taken are right in comparison to what we're being told by, for example, the IPCC. So when I speak to, you know, 12, 13-year-olds who are told that we have 12 years left to prevent catastrophic climate change, just imagine the fear that instills in someone of that age. And that's why there's been this massive rise in this thing called eco-anxiety, which is just almost this existential fear of, am I going to have no future? And when you're a bit older, you can understand the complexity of it. But when you're 12, 13, and you're told that we have 12 years left, it seems quite black and white. And I don't think it's easy to not feel overwhelmingly anxious at a statement like that.
Yeah. I'm thinking this is quite ironic, but if it's when it gets to 5 years' time, then they can re-release a David Bowie track, which is called 5 Years, which is actually talking about the end of the world.
Is that an actual track?
Yeah, 5 years. Listen,
Okay.
it's nice. It's dark, but it's nice. In your book, you talk about consumerism. My one big overriding question is, can you temper consumerism? Can you moderate it? Is it possible to do that?
So, yes, definitely is the simple answer. I think human nature is to want to consume. But if you look at lots of things popping up right now, there are ways to consume that don't follow the same linear point of view as we have been in the past few decades. So for example, I just touched on it briefly, but Amsterdam following a circular economy in 2020. So they're prioritizing not using primary resources. They're prioritizing subsidizing companies which recycle, which don't have planned obsolescence for their products, so their products aren't going to kind of dismantle in the same way lots of Apple products are designed to do. So I think we need to temper consumerism, but also consume things which we know are more ethical and sustainable. And just speaking to young people, there's a massive growth because it's become trendy, and I don't really like it, but that is what humans are about. We're social creatures, and when things become trendy, we follow it. And it has become trendy now to go to charity shops, to buy on Depop, to buy on Vinted, and everyone at uni it's a massive statement to just walk around in charity shop clothes, and to see people going to places like Mango and Pretty Little Thing is really stigmatized. So that's in the last few years, seeing that happen. And that's purely because it's become the trend. And I know as an environmentalist, I'm just assuming that you're also against trends and things like that, but is what's happened, and it's so good to see that. So yeah, what would you think about that?
Well, firstly, I'm thinking, we in Britain anyway live in a very classist society. So I think a lot of the things you're talking about may not necessarily wash or even filter down to some people within the working class end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go to university. I know lots of people that did, obviously, but I know lots of people that didn't. I know lots of people that are doing, well and having high-flying jobs. I know lots of people that haven't and aren't working. And there is a difference in terms of attitude. For some people, life is about getting through it. And if I want to go to McDonald's, I'm going to McDonald's, and I'll be chucking my carton on the floor regardless, So there's an element of education here. And that's, I think, a massive issue. Because I go to places like America, and I've been up even in other countries, like, for example, Georgia, right next to that horrible place that's currently attacking Ukraine. And I see people. I mean, I walked onto the beach in Georgia, and it was just, there was more plastic and just general crap on the floor than there were rocks on the beach. And for them, it's just one of those things, they just get on and deal with it. That's what they do. So I think, again, it's going back to what we're talking about in the very beginning. It's just, how do you get everyone to be on the same page? It's so difficult.
I think one big thing is, this isn't to do with consumption necessarily, but there's such a disparity between who's creating the impacts and who's facing the impacts. And one massive element of last year's COP26 was this climate finance, and 100 billion was meant to be given each year by developed to developing countries. And there's been no follow through with that. And I think one of the massive responsibilities of those with the ability and the time and the privilege to sit back and think about sustainability, to have the time to, to go to charity shops and be impressed by what other people are wearing in charity shops, things like that, have the responsibility to mitigate their own impacts, but also aid. And this is hard to say in a non-contentious way, but aid, for example, in the developing world. That's what should have happened at COP26, and it should happen at COP27. And if that climate finance isn't given, I think that's one of the biggest crimes of those in power and our government, because we've created so many of the impacts which are, affecting people who have emitted less than 0.01% of the emissions, such as the Solomon Islands, which are already migrating and are one of the lowest emitting countries in the world.
You talk in the book, and I love this notion that you push of not being about publicly shaming people. I mean, that's one thing you keep on saying in all the things you've written in the book, which I think is great. What do you think about the carbon footprints and the eco-travel element? Because I've noticed, especially since lockdown, a number of people who have been sort of pointing fingers saying, how dare you get on a plane? How dare you travel? Look at your carbon footprint. And for example, last year, the Global Bird Fair, which is big festival, which has been reborn after sort of dying a couple of years ago. A lot of people are complaining about travel companies coming over here to Britain and enticing us to travel to these far-fetched lands. I'll give you my opinion first, actually, and that is, it makes me kind of a bit angry, because when these people are saying these things, they don't often realize the implications or realize why people travel. I mean, I travel, but I try to do as little as possible in terms of traveling. But when I do travel, I try and stay in that particular place as long as possible. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm also reporting. I'm a writer, so I report back as to what's happening in those particular places to highlight the conservation issues and possibly to attract ecotourism, so that people can go to those places and actually put money from their pocket straight into the economy to help, you know, the plight of the environment and the wildlife there. And I've said this before to the Zoomers, and please don't, you know, I hope I'm not being boring, but the only kind of people I really respect who turn around and point fingers at me or others are the people who live barefoot in the woods eating berries, of which I know none, to be honest. Because I spoke to one person who she said, I haven't traveled since 2013 abroad. I said, fine. So you don't fly? Not at all. So you don't go abroad then? She said, yes, I do, but I drive. And I'm thinking, well, you know, so what are your thoughts on this carbon footprint shaming stuff?
Well, I mean, the term carbon footprint itself was coined by BP, which I think says a lot in itself, that an oil and gas company can come up with a seemingly sustainable term. And I agree with you that, you know, if you live in a forest, you just breathe air, don't consume any food, you're deemed a hippie. I've heard of those breatharians, actually. It's crazy. They just survive on air. Anyway, so if you live in the forest, you're deemed a hippie. If you live within society and you want to make change within society, you're deemed a hypocrite. So really, whatever you do, if you're going to face opposition. And I think it is this spectrum, and wherever you are on the spectrum, you're not going to be purged of hypocrisy in order to stand up. And so I would say to people, yes, keep moving towards a more sustainable, ethical life, but you can speak up and you can oppose the big corporations and the governments which are incentivizing this growth and subsidizing fossil fuel companies, even if you yourself are part of the system, because I think in order to change the system, you do have to be part of it. And I've flown. In 2019, I was making a documentary, and we flew for the documentary, and it was about extinction and solutions to the sixth mass extinction. And to meet the people who had these solutions, we flew to some places. Some of it was getting the train, but some of it was flying. And like you, I kind of justified that by thinking about, is this going to have a bigger impact when it reaches the audience than the singular flight that I'm going to take there and back? And, you know, some people have completely gone off flying. I know, well, Greta, the biggest example I can think of, who went off flying. But yeah, I would agree with you. No one's going to be purged of hypocrisy. And I don't think in order to have a voice and to speak up, you shouldn't be. Otherwise, who are we going to have? We'll have no voices at all. So surely it's better to have people who aren't completely there, but have the power and the ambition to speak up and call out the bigger corporations who are causing the majority of the issues.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about slow travel in your book, and I think it's a really nice concept, but
yeah,
for most people, it's not practical because, for example, you know, you've only got 2 weeks holiday and you can't spend 2 weeks getting to your holiday. And for people like me, for example, I need to be there for a certain time or dates to give a talk or whatever, or lead a tour. So there's no real easy way around it. And even in this country where people, I'm out birding today in Yorkshire, Lamberhead, and I met a couple of birders and I was just talking, and a few of them actually said, I haven't traveled since lockdown began, since the beginning of the pandemic. But their reasons aren't because they want to stop their carbon footprint. But I mean, it is now, but it wasn't at the beginning, obviously, because we couldn't anyway. But then some of those people then recount stories of them driving to, like 400 miles to try and twitch a bird and then driving back home again. And I'm thinking, well, what's worse?
Yeah.
There's no, again, like you say, it's very grey. And that's why you cannot point fingers when the subject you're talking about is grey.
Yeah, well, I do talk about slow travel, but also rewilding and about mindset, because lots of the birding you do is in the UK, and so many people see the UK as this ecological wasteland. And yes, actually lots of it is, because our government and also the agricultural system and as individuals, we haven't done our bit to protect our own wildlife on our doorstep. But saying that, if we focus on the possibility that the UK could have as a haven for wildlife, and one of the people I spoke to, Harvey Tweets, who was doing his A-levels, when I spoke to him, is focused on rewilding, and he had one of the largest outdoor facilities for reptile and amphibian breeding in the UK, and he was just doing his A-levels with his friend, and they were focusing on this. And what he talked a lot about was imagination and what our wilderness could be like. And so maybe we wouldn't feel the need to travel to exotic places if we all fostered this imagination and we knew what the British wilderness could be like. And have you been to Knepp in Sussex? Because this incredible haven, this bubble almost of the future. It's just incredible that we could move towards that. And then maybe people wouldn't feel the need to travel so much. So I think we should focus on rewilding, slow travel. And once again, it's this blanket of solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been to Knepp, to my shame, and I must go one day. But what's interesting is there is now going to be a GCSE for natural history. It's amazing, brilliant. And one thing I want to suggest.
Would you have taken it?
Absolutely, I'll take it. I'm going to take it anyway.
Go back to school. I'll go back with you. We can be in a class.
Exactly, I'm going to take it. But
this could be our class here. Everyone today.
But one thing I would suggest is a field trip to Knepp, or a bit more sort of exotic in a way, but a field trip to Eastern Europe or to the Baltic states, because when you go to Southeastern Europe, for example, you're seeing agriculture, you're seeing farming methods, you're seeing countryside, which basically was is what Britain was 200 years ago. So you're walking around, you're seeing a multitude of birds and wildlife and, and reptiles and stuff. And I'm thinking, well, why can't we have that? Because it's more or less the same species, but 10 times more, and it doesn't take much. And I think given what the state has done in Sussex, down there in Sussex, in such a short period of time, it shows you how quickly nature can reclaim areas that were once lost, and they come from nowhere. I mean, they've had nightingales and turtle doves just show up. There's no reintroduction scheme. They just show up because the habitat's there. It doesn't take much. And it's embarrassing to know that Britain is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. I feel so embarrassed to be British and hearing that, because it's, we are the forefront of conservation in many ways. We're out there, we're pointing fingers at people like Malta and all those guys, yet we're killing loads of stuff on our own land. So it's just and
it really puts into perspective how tokenistic it is on social media. Like when the wildfires in Amazon were happening in the Amazon in, I think it was beginning of 2020, and everyone was pointing fingers, and the wildfires in California, at trophy hunting, and we stand on this moral pedestal thinking that, as you say, because we're at the forefront of conservation, we have the right to speak out. And whilst we should, can we really criticize other countries for destroying their rainforest when our rainforest is completely gone because of our past actions? So I think before we point fingers, or whilst we point fingers, we also need to have our other hand,
pointing at us as well.
Yeah.
All right, I'll ask you one more question before we close this evening, and just a very brief answer really, but I'm quite fascinated with this disconnect from nature, which you've written about. Part of the reason why I exist as the Urban Birder is all about trying to connect people, especially in urban areas where most of us live. What are your kind of suggestions in terms of trying to get people to understand the world we live in?
So it's what we just spoke about, I think, ties really into this disconnection from nature, because in urban areas, there's this stat from the RSPB which says 75% of young kids spend less time outside than prison inmates, which is a stat, is an odd one, but it demonstrates how disconnected young people are in urban areas from nature. And I think, yes, it's partly due to technology, it's partly due to safety issues and vehicles and polluted roads, but also it's the fact that what nature are we expecting young people to go out into? In different areas in London, there are parks, yes, but they're these sterile stretches of grass, and I wouldn't call that nature. And I think if we want to have this connection with nature, we need to have natural spaces within urban areas that are thriving, where there are wildflower meadows, where we're reintroducing species, where people are actually excited to go to. Sorry, someone's knocking. I'm not done yet.
We lasted an hour.
Yeah, I said at 8:01 you can come and knock on my door because I'll be ready, but
Okay, another few minutes. Well, let
Yeah.
me just quickly ask you, where would you be in this world if you could be anywhere now?
Costa Rica, probably, because of what they're doing, because of the way the government has prioritized reforestation right now. They've put the ecology at the center of everything they're doing, and that's what COP15, they're aiming to do that for every government. But Costa Rica's there, they've done it, and they don't need to. We've talked about imagination, they don't need to imagine it because they've done it, and they're just all so happy.
Yeah, they are so happy. And what's your favorite animal, Bella?
Orangutan.
Very definite. Zoomers, just to let you know, coming up on the 24th of October, we've got Andrew Budiak, who's a photographer, and he specializes in urban wildlife photography. And on the 27th of October, we've got a guy called Dr. Bob Plank, who was the co-starter, originator of the Zeno Canto library of sounds, bird sounds. And on the 8th of November, we got Ifan Lee, who is going to be talking about bird conservation in China. So we've got a ton of stuff coming up. That's just 3 conversations coming up. We've got a ton more. Bella, thank you so much. I know how difficult it is to get hold of you, and I know how much in demand you are in terms of going out and stuff like that, as well as the work you do. And I'm looking forward to watching you as being one of the shining lights that all of us will be sort of listening to and following. So thank you very much, Bella.
Thank you so much.
And Zoomers, thank you. Bella hasn't got much time, so I'm going to say, keep looking up.